This is a conversation with Christopher Kirschoff. Chris founded and led the Defense Innovation Unit, also known as Unit X, which is an organization within the Pentagon tasked with finding the most innovative emerging technology, anything from flying cars to microsatellites, and implementing it into the US military. That makes him quite a unique person to talk to about where all this tech innovation in the defense and military space is going, and how is it going to change the future of warfare, but also about why is it often so hard for governments to keep up with pace of technology, why organizations like governments and militaries often fight against innovation rather than embracing it, or how do the US, Europe, China compare in their ability to innovate, and who's winning the new tech race of today. If you want to get more geopolitical analysis for free to help filter all the noise from the stuff that actually matters, you can sign up to my newsletter. There I break down big picture geopolitical stories, trends, and patterns that actually matter, and try to provide real signal and real intelligence. You can find the link in the description. And as a reminder, the corporate sponsor of this podcast is Conductor, which provides software for crisis exercises for everything from cyber threats and supply chain security to hybrid warfare. And now, enjoy the conversation. So, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
Well, so I want to talk about quite a lot of diverse topics today that all relate to innovation in defense and sort of future of warfare. But first, I want to talk about the reason why you have, in particular, more insight on this than almost anyone else I can imagine, which is because of your experience with launching or co-launching and co-leading the Defense Innovation Unit as part of the Pentagon. And I assume that most people are probably not familiar with it unless they've read your book. So can we maybe start by briefly explaining what the DIU was or is, and what led to the idea that something like that was needed when you were launching it 10 years ago?
Well, Dominic, thanks again for having me on, and thanks for letting me share with your listeners the story of Defense Innovation Unit Experimental, which it really is an extraordinary story. It began with an insight that Ash Carter, who became Obama's last Secretary of Defense, but had way back when he was an academic teaching at the Harvard Kennedy School. In 2001, he wrote a paper that noticed a very important divergence of trends in research and development in the United States. In the Cold War, the R&D labs for the military, there are 53 of them, plus DARPA and a number of other large research labs, really had a kind of monopoly on advanced technology. They were very well funded. They were the ones pioneering fundamental advancements, whether it was stealth or GPS. The technology they had really was more advanced than anybody else had. And the way that the technology ecosystem in the United States worked during the Cold War is technology would gradually flow from the defense labs, from the space race into consumer products. And what Ash Carter noticed as a professor is this trend was beginning to change, that at the end of the Cold War, as part of the peace dividend, not only had the United States dramatically reduced its research and development funding, but at the same time, the commercial technology economy, which was going global, with the rise of Google and Apple and Amazon, really became a dominant force. And in fact, if you fast forward to the year Defense Innovation Unit was started in 2015, any one of the large tech companies, Google, Apple, Amazon, Microsoft, had a greater market cap than the entire US defense sector. So that tells you that the locus of innovation has shifted, that there are more innovators now working in the commercial sector than there are in the defense sector. And so Ash Carter, when he became secretary, knew he needed to access this other supply chain of technology for the military. And as a result, sent Raj Shah and I ultimately in 2016 out to Silicon Valley to help helm Defense Innovation Unit.
I want to maybe dig a little deeper into that, because as you've mentioned, I find it so interesting that not that long ago, it was actually the military and the Pentagon that was at the birth of all these technologies. You've mentioned GPS, but I mean, even the internet was created by DARPA originally, and then it became adopted by the commercial civilian sector. And I think it makes sense that since the market cap of the big tech is now a lot bigger than the defense budget, they would be doing the ones they would be the ones pushing the innovation. But I guess what the Pentagon struggled with before launching the DIU, and what was part of the reasons with launching the DIU, was that not only it wasn't Pentagon that wasn't developing those technologies, but I guess it also struggled with adopting those technologies from the commercial sector and applying them in the military. And that kind of suggests that maybe at some point Pentagon sort of forgot how to innovate, maybe, even though not that long ago before that, it was the leader of innovation. And if that sort of logic is correct, why did that happen, and how did it happen?
Well, the way that I might describe it is it's not that the Pentagon ever stopped innovating. I mean, DARPA has always been at the leading edge of multiple technological domains. The military labs are part of a deliberately less aggressive R&D ecosystem who are not trying, like DARPA is, to make wild, risky bets that would lead to, step changes in technology. Most of the R&D labs in the military are focused on making slow, incremental progress. So how can we make the Mark 48 torpedo a little bit more effective, or how can we over time improve an electronic warfare system? And they do good work in the sense that, there are major weapons platforms that the United States has fielded along with our allies, whether that's the Aegis battleship system or aircraft carriers, or certainly nuclear submarines that have been dominant for decades. So the military and its contractors, were steaming ahead after the peace dividend, after the end of the Cold War, with these, supporting and developing further major weapons platforms. But they did it in a way that was, now a little bit old fashioned, and they did it in a way that made sense at the time. And that way is to have primarily a requirements driven process for building technology. So if you are, Pentagon planners and you're designing the next, say, fifth generation stealth fighter, you're sitting on the best research on stealth. And so you actually have the knowledge then, if you're at a time when the military labs are generations of technology ahead of the consumer technology, to specify what you need in a weapons platform. And so this was done, for the F-35 fighter, which we have on the cover of Unit X. And the challenge, though, is that the F-35 fighter was, the design was finalized in the late 1990s, production contract awarded in 2001. And because of the way the military industrial complex builds technology, it's very slow compared to the commercial sector. So the F-35 didn't actually become operational until 2016, which is extraordinary. I mean, that's a 15-year build. And of course, the technology that flew down the runway in 2016 was 1999 or 2000 technology. So, do you want to take a guess which had the faster computer processor in 2016? The F-35 or the iPhone 7?
I would say it was the iPhone.
It was the iPhone. The iPhone 7 processor in 2016 was about 100 times faster than the chips the F-35 used in its initial configuration, which are functionally equivalent to Intel's Pentium 4 chip, which you can view today in the Museum of Computer History in Silicon Valley. So what this tells you is that existing system of production was not able to reach out and grab new technology and insert it kind of mid-design. And then I think the Pentagon was also just missing a whole nother revolution. So already in 2015, ISIS on the battlefield in Iraq and Syria were very effective at buying DJI drones, literally off Amazon. You can just order them for $300, weaponizing them, using them to drop grenades on U.S. forces, using them to foil special forces raids, because drones are very effective at surveillance. So the Pentagon, at the same time, it wasn't updating the way it was building these large weapons platforms. It also wasn't accessing this whole new stream of consumer technology that our adversaries were already showing were ready to go to the battlefield.
So maybe getting back to the DIU, if those were the problems, what were your specific tasks and how you were supposed to change that, and how did you approach it?
Well, DIU today is a real force. I mean, it's has $1 billion budget. It has a large staff. It has partnerships with a lot of our allies, innovation centers, and it's doing really important work, bringing some of the most advanced commercial technology to the parts of our military that really are the tip of the spear today in the Pacific region and in Europe. But when we began DIU, it was a very small experimental operation. We had about 35 people. We had an organic budget of right around $30 million. And, this is in the scope of a $800 billion defense department with 3 million people. So we knew from the get-go that, we were not going to be able to single-handedly fix all the military's legacy technology problems. But we did know that we could make a dent in them and maybe start kind of a snowball rolling downhill. And so when we came in, we had a few core objectives. The first was just to prove to our peers in the military that commercial technology was battlefield ready. There was this sense in the Pentagon that, sure, Google's neat and cloud and mobile and search, but these are for consumers. Like iPhones are for my kids to play with. They're not going to revolutionize what we do on the battlefield. And we set out to prove that wrong, to show that you could take off the shelf technology, deploy it right away, and it would, in many use cases, be far more powerful than the technology soldiers and airmen had, and far more effective. The second thing that we set out to prove, and this was really hard, is for the first time to make the Department of Defense a good customer in Silicon Valley. So in 2015, the Pentagon was an awful customer. If you were a startup and you had a new piece of technology that you knew the military could use today, you had no reason to sell it to the Pentagon, because in order to be able to bid on a contract, you would have to learn and master the thousands of pages of federal acquisition rules and the Defense Department's federal acquisition rules supplement. You would have to stand up a completely bespoke auditing system that would allow the Defense Audit and Accounting Agency to perform audits of your books to make sure you were spending taxpayer dollar worthy and money wisely. And to set this up, it would be, an enormously expensive initial investment. And if you're a 10 or 15 or 20 or even 100-person startup, why do this? I mean, sure, the Department of Defense, it thinks it has a big budget, and it does. I mean, the Department of Defense has a $230 billion acquisition budget, but the global market for consumer technology is $25 trillion. So if you're a startup and you say, hey, I want to try and sell to the government, your investors will tell you don't. They'll tell you it's going to take 12 to 18 months to negotiate a FAR-based contract. It's highly likely that you will be outbid by someone who's smarter at writing proposals and has better lobbyists, even if their technology is worse. And even if your first FAR-based contract is successful and the military decides to rebid that contract for a larger amount, then all of a sudden, all the defense industrial contractors will come and try and steal the contract back away from you. So when we arrived in the Valley, the conventional wisdom was don't even take a call with the government because it's bad business. And investors would actually threaten to withdraw their further funding from startups that did try and sell to the government.
If you're enjoying this podcast, chances are that you like to know what's going on in the world of geopolitics. And if that's the case, you might want to sign up to my newsletter. There's a lot of news on geopolitics, but most of it just doesn't actually matter. It's just chasing headlines, emotions, and breaking news. What I want to do is to try to separate all this noise and find the signal, the stuff that actually does matter and will have consequences months and years down the line. You can find the link in the description, so check it out and sign up to stay informed. Is that still the thing that VCs say today? Because I would say that today it's exactly the opposite, and you've probably had a part in that where defense tech is the new hot thing, and especially in Silicon Valley and in the US and now in Europe as well, it's starting to be, but there's, it feels like that's where a lot of the money is going and where what all the new young startups want to do.
So at the core of Ash Carter's vision, it wasn't just to reach into the valley and grab already existing technology. It was more ambitious than that. Ash knew that there's an enormous amount of money in venture capital today. And that if that capital were deployed to back young, talented engineers and small startups to try and do things differently, in the classic Silicon Valley way, where a small amount of engineering talent and a small amount of incremental funding can really go a long way. I mean, this is how Google got its start, right? Two people with a Stanford research project that grew that into one of the most valuable corporations in the world. So Ash Carter wanted to get venture capitalists willing to back startups that were working on defense applications. So what happened is a story of how one individual can truly make an extraordinary difference in a large institution. And her name was Lauren Daly. She was 29 years old when we met her the first week at Defense Innovation Unit. She was the in-house acquisition specialist. Her father had served in the Army as a tank driver, and she became a civilian in the Army, specialized in acquisition. And you said, there's this whole other way of contracting that's outside the federal acquisition rules called OT, or other transaction authorities. DARPA uses it a lot. But I just read in this year's National Defense Authorization Act that there's a huge expansion of OT authority. And I think we could use that to buy technology from startups here in Silicon Valley really quick, in just a matter of a few weeks rather than months. And so we immediately asked, well, gosh, could you maybe write up your idea so we could understand it better? And Lauren whips out a white paper she'd already written. And with the help of Secretary Carter, we were able to have the Pentagon Acquisition Office codify this new authority in a matter of weeks and publish it, actually. We made a kind of how-to guide. Lauren named the new authority a Commercial Solutions Offering, CSO. And that contracting type has now been used by Defense Innovation Unit and the Pentagon to buy $70 billion worth of commercial technology since 2016. And because the Pentagon is now a good customer, you're now seeing venture capital very willing to back new investors. So Ash Carter's insight allowed an enormous snowball effect of the government becoming a better customer and venture capitalists then deciding to engage in this sector.
It sounds that what we were talking about is also quite closely related to something else, which is that the system of acquisition and government contracts that you were describing it seems like the ones that were really benefiting from it were the existing big defense companies, the defense primes, that had the capability to go through all that bureaucracy, and also that there was this specific system in which research contracts would be given to those companies. That's called, I think, cost plus research contracts. And I've heard Palmer Luckey, the founder of Enderil, which is one of the most innovative defense companies today, really criticize that particular system and how it kind of held back the US military and innovation quite a lot. How much do you think that the fact that there was sort of an oligopoly for a long time of these major defense giants that were all splitting the defense contracts between themselves, and that they were doing it through this not very effective system, how big of an impact do you think it had on the innovation within Pentagon and within the military?
Well, I'll share just one story that shows the tension that still exists today between the defense primes, which we have to bear in mind are entirely creations of U.S. industrial policy. The way the primes operate today are the result of very deliberate and specific decisions that were made by the Congress, by the Pentagon leadership, from the end of the Cold War forward. We have created large companies that are highly regulated, that can only respond to requirements-based contracting, and that have capital structures that don't allow them to, for instance, acquire other firms and bring innovation in. And this is Palmer Luckey's very important argument that is a recipe for failure in today's fast-moving technology world, that the way to be successful is to be, in his words, a product company first, which is a forward-looking company that looks at what trends are coming and then allows their engineers to design future products that are not connected to a bunch of people in a windowless room coming up with requirements for what they think the future will bring. And so you're seeing these two systems now begin to bump into each other. And we chronicle an early collision that happened around the Combined Air Operations Center in Qatar, the CAOC, which is the nerve center that the U.S. Air Force runs all air operations with in the Middle East. And in 2016, this was the busiest command center in the world because we were in the middle of an extraordinary coalition-based air war effort against ISIS. And the number of strikes were higher in tempo than any previous war in the world. This is a historic air campaign. And the airmen managing that, when Raj Shah and Eric Schmidt, the former CEO of Google, who as chair of the Defense Innovation Board visited the CAOC to look at his technology, discovered a bunch of airmen in front of a whiteboard. And they were moving pucks, magnetic pucks around on the whiteboard. And they asked, what on earth are you doing with this whiteboard and pucks and a bunch of laptops open in front of it? And they said, well, we're planning tomorrow's tanker refueling schedule. And Raj looked at Eric and Eric looked at Raj and they learned more. And they said, yes, we're supposed to have an app that does this, but it hasn't been updated, so it doesn't work. And we've been waiting 5 years for the update and it's in the hands of a defense contractor. And they think they might be able to deliver it 2 years from now. But in the meantime, it takes 50 person hours each day to manually plan tanker orbits, which are complicated because jet aircraft and fighter aircraft refuel in different configurations at different altitudes at different speeds. And so if you're trying to maintain a very high tempo air operation, which by the way is doing things like preventing a genocide on Mount Sinjar, where you have tens of thousands of Yazidi men, women, and children trapped and surrounded by fighters trying to kill them. So this is very serious stuff. So Eric Schmidt told Raj, hey, go fix this for these guys. This is a simple software fix. And indeed, we shipped out a bunch of iMacs and 3 Air Force programmers and a small number of programmers from Silicon Valley in 132 days for $1.4 million. They had an app that was able to perform that function in less than 60 seconds. And that app paid for itself because it actually came up with more efficient solutions. And you could also then have it run again if there were a change in the weather or a change in combat, at the tempo of combat. That app, has the Air Force now estimates saves 25 million gallons of jet fuel each year. It was a remarkable success. So ask the question, did people in the Air Force hierarchy like the app, or did they want to shut it down?
Well, I would probably assume, since you're asking that way, that they wanted to shut it down.
Yeah, the commander of the CAOC loved it because it was a safer and far more accurate way of planning tanker operations, and it freed up a lot of his personnel's time. The Air Force program officer managing the defense contractor that was years late on updating the software didn't like it, thought it was a nice demonstration, but wanted to kind of keep doing things the old way. And so they initially told us, no, thank you. We're going to take your pilot down and we're going to force the guys to go back to the whiteboard. And the commander, of the CAOC got really upset and said, no, this is helping in an important way and we need to keep it. And, luckily Senator John McCain, who heard this story and then who investigated it and who had Raj privately into his office to learn what was going on, told the Air Force in a hearing to go to hell. They were going to have to work with us and use our solution rather than go back to doing things the old way.
Just a quick break here to let you know that the corporate sponsor of this podcast is Conductor, which provides software for crisis exercises for everything from cyber threats and supply chain security to hybrid warfare. Thank you, Conductor, for sponsoring this podcast. And now, back to the conversation. So why didn't that person like it? Because I assume that, it wasn't about that person, but more that that person was a representing of a symptom of a much larger issue within the organization. So why didn't they like it?
Well, it's always important to, in moments like this, become a little bit of an organizational sociologist or a historian and ask, why is it that people that are smart, right, that have engineering degrees are very much insisting upon doing things in a way that to you looks not obvious? Why would you want to keep doing things the old way when the old way, from a newcomer's eye, has a lot of disadvantages? So, to work themselves into their mindset, they're dealing with a very complicated systems engineering challenge where the CAOC itself is full of legacy systems, some of which are actually older than the airmen operating them. They're pursuing a very complex upgrade of multiple systems at once. It's actually hard in that context in the old systems engineering approach to kind of allow something that's new and different to sit in a family of other systems that are not. And in their view, sure, they were over budget, but everybody's over budget. Sure, they were behind schedule, but that's totally normal. And in fact, they were working really hard to finish the contract. And so in their eyes, it just wasn't worth shutting everything down and reimagining it because they weren't, they didn't have the authority even to do that. It would take Congress changing legislation and rewinding the contract, which the defense industrial contractor would probably protest. It would probably end up in court forever, right? Tied up in a GAO assessment of whether the government has wronged the contractor. So there were real constraints and real risks actually in adopting this new method. And the only reason why they ultimately did is after Senator McCain gave his ultimatum, the program officer, to his credit, came out to Silicon Valley, spent a couple weeks at the DIU office, learning new approaches to programming, seeing how much faster things were under the new system, and decided to do something extraordinary. He and the program manager on our end, who headed the tanker refueling program, Enrique Ote, convinced the Air Force leadership to start the Air Force's first software factory, a giant unit called Castle Run that ultimately had 1,300 people working at it to improve the Air Force's software. So that little tussle between the new defense tech ecosystem and Defense Prime that was behind schedule spurred, in the end, an extraordinary amount of innovation in the Air Force.
I think that the story that you've mentioned and what happened then, I think it really well explains this more common thing that tends to happen, and that I've experienced myself working in a government and working with the military as part of that. That I think tends to happen in large organizations, that everyone knows that things aren't working as they should ideally, and the way things are done are not really done in an ideal way, but still it's almost impossible for the organization to change that unless you have someone like, in your example, John McCain, who can come and kind of with enough authority push it through. But I feel like what you're describing, these institutional changes, are just tend to be extremely difficult.
There's a wonderful book that's a classic in the political science and organizational sociology literature by the sociologist James Q. Wilson called Bureaucracy. And he opens the book with an anecdote of standing, he was a professor at Harvard when he wrote the book, on the corner in Massachusetts. On one side of the street was the Department of Motor Vehicles, where he had to go to renew his license. And on the other street was McDonald's. And he asked, which is going to get you what you want faster and easier? Is it going to be McDonald's, where you go in and you order something and 3 minutes later it's delivered? Or is it going to be the DMV, where he brings a bunch of paperwork in and he has to go from station to station and it takes forever, right? Why is it that McDonald's is so much more efficient than a public sector institution? And of course, there's a structural set of reasons why public institutions are typically behind the times. And it has to do with the fact that they're balancing many different goals, often of which are conflicting. McDonald's is responding to a much simpler set of incentives, the profit motive. They ask the question, what will make us the most money? The director of the DMV is asking a different set of questions. How can I lawfully get people licenses without getting in trouble? The director of the DMV probably doesn't have the authority to upgrade their IT system to make things easier and faster. They have to go back to the state legislature. But of course, the state legislature is balancing many different constraints and probably hasn't, funded an IT renewal for the DMV for years. So they're probably stuck dealing with legacy systems that are years behind state of the art. And indeed, those incentives that plague the DMV, which all of us have experienced when we try and go get our license renewed here in the United States, also plague the U.S. military. It's a very deeply an institutional problem of institutions and culture.
So how, if you sort of take a step back and you would assess how is the situation in technology innovation and adoption of new technology in the U.S. military and Pentagon, how it is, what's the situation today, 10 years after the DIU was launched, given that I would assume the need to do that is probably even larger today than ever before, given the challenges that the U.S. military is facing with competition with China, and also the fact that the pace of technological development is today extremely fast. So how good or bad do you think the situation is today?
Well, there's a lot of challenges still, and a pessimist could cite a lot of figures that are alarming, and I'll just throw out a few here. I mean, one is that almost all of the advanced battle tanks we gave the Ukrainians, the M1A1s, our most advanced battle tank in the world, have been taken off the battlefield by Russian kamikaze drones, which tells an observer like me that the era of man mechanized warfare is probably over. And that's a problem if you're an advanced military, like many in the United States and many in Europe that have spent a lot of money buying tanks. Because it turns out they can now be taken off the battlefield by $2,000 and $3,000 kamikaze drones. So, ask the question: well, has the U.S. military stopped buying tanks and started buying drones? And the answer is, just a little bit. The Replicator Initiative, which was important, was led by Defense Innovation Unit, was nevertheless 0.7% of the department's acquisition budget.
Can you maybe explain what the Replicator Initiative is?
Yeah, the Replicator Initiative was a way to begin experimenting with autonomous platforms at scale, to buy what some strategists call attritable mass. So affordable systems that are very effective, that do not take decades to produce and cost enormous amounts. They're not necessarily exquisite technology in the way that, say, a B-2 stealth bomber is. So it's a very important and directionally correct initiative, but ultimately a very small part of the Department of Defense acquisition budget. And similarly, if you look at the amount of money of the Department of Defense budget going to venture-backed defense tech companies, it's like 1% or 1.5%. It's a very small amount. So in some senses, the good news is that there is this new defense tech ecosystem coming into play that's venture-backed, that's based, around solid product companies that can really move fast and for not a lot of money. In fact, there's now half a dozen unicorns, companies now evaluated over $1 billion. Anduril, of course, but other ones like Shield AI, Skydio. So we really face this interesting conundrum of industrial policy where we need to try and grow new defense tech companies and continue enlarging the amount of technology from those companies that the Pentagon ingests and deploys. But at the same time, we're going to ultimately have to help the primes innovate, the old defense contractors that are stuck in this requirements-based system, because we're going to be living for a long time in an era of hybrid war, where there are going to be these incredibly advanced attritable systems powered largely by globally available microelectronics that are deadly ineffective, but they're going to operate in conjunction with some of our traditional weapons platforms, whether that's stealth bombers or stealth fighters. One of the most interesting doctrinal innovations of the last administration was the Air Force's move to combat collaborative aircraft. So this is a vision of having supersonic drones, maybe 5 or 6 or 7 of them for each manned 5th generation fighter, flying in offensive configurations that allows the drones to take on riskier missions than a human pilot, whether that's surveillance or long range strike. So this is an extraordinary revolution in air war doctrine that Secretary Frank Kendall pursued when he led the Air Force. And that contract, the CCA contract, went to Anduril and General Atomics. They beat out the defense primes because the Air Force found their technology to be demonstrably superior. And so this is an example of the world I think we're moving in, and we need to pull all the policy levels possible to bring this world into existence as fast as we possibly can, so we don't end up in a situation where the next war our adversary is fighting with drones and all we have is tanks.
Well, I think since you've mentioned the war in Ukraine, I think that's a good example of another issue. I think that probably all at least Western nation states are struggling with, which is the fact that I don't know about the US acquisition system, but I would say that in most European countries, it takes from the moment when someone realizes that we would probably, in the military, we would probably need some kind of a new technology to the point, even when the technology exists and someone is already making it, to the point when it's bought and then delivered to the soldiers who would be actually using it, it takes probably several years, somewhere between 2 and 5, maybe on average. But if you look at the war in Ukraine, often the technology is not developing from a year to year, but from a month to month. And the progress of what you need is just extremely fast. And what was cutting edge today is probably 3 months down the line is not going to be, is going to be useless, perhaps completely. So how do you deal with that when the pace of this is just so much faster than what the systems are built for and what we've seen at any time before today? Thank you for listening to this conversation. If you'd like to hear the rest of it, you can find it on my Patreon. Click the link in the description or go to patreon.com/decodinggeopolitics. And if you decide to become a supporter, you get bonus content, Patreon-only episodes, and you will be able to ask questions to my future guests.